Have you ever wondered how all of the base game cards in Terraforming Mars stack up against each other? What are the standouts that you always need to play around, and which ones can you mostly ignore in the draft? Then you've clicked on the right video, because this is the final video and summary of my Terraforming Mars base game card rating series. In this series, I've looked at each and every card in the base game extensively and ranked them in one of 7 tiers, ranging from S tier for the absolute best cards in the game to Y tier, reserved for exactly one superb shitter of a card. The series went on for over 2 years, which is kinda scary to think about. But what will I do in today's video? Well, not only will I give you an overview of the rating as a whole, I will also go over it and see which cards were misplaced or which ones I changed my opinion on in the meantime. This way I will end up with a rating that I'm completely fine with before we move on to the expansions. Of course, showing the whole ranking on screen is absolutely impossible. We are speaking about 208 cards here. But the whole original ranking can be found as a Google Doc in the description if you want to check it out. You will also find the whole updated ranking down there, because now I will go through the tiers from bottom to top, show all cards in those tiers first, and then explain what I will change. Every time I'm talking about a specific card, I will also put the number of the episode on screen in which I talked about it. You will find a link to the whole playlist in the description. The lowest tier is a very recent addition to this rating system, and it's called the Whyyy tier. It is and will probably always be reserved for exactly one card: Underground Detonations. There's not much to talk about here. Underground Deaths is the worst card in the game by far and should never be used. Obviously, it will not be moved. Next up, we have F tier, home to 17 quite horrible cards. They are all really bad on average, but still have their niche use cases. Dust Seals, for example, is often a fine play if you just draw it for free, since the majority of its cost stems from buying it. But we are looking at all of these cards from the perspective of seeing them in the draft, paying to buy them and suffering the opportunity cost of not buying other cards instead, which makes Dust Seals especially sad. Still, I think I was too harsh on some of these cards here. Many of you have pointed out that Magnetic Field Generators, which was discussed in episode 23, and Cloud Seeding, which I talked about in episode 8, both deserve a D tier placement, and I kinda agree. The former can be a great steal dump in the late game, yielding 3 points immediately, and also possibly enabling another greenery conversion. If heat gets maxed out fast and you have power prot and steel left over, it's actually one of the better cards to find in the draft. Of course, if you neither have tons of steel or power prot, it's absolutely useless. That's why it was placed so low originally. Cloud Seeding, on the other hand, has a very short window in the early to mid game where it can be great to play and devastating to get hit by. The problem with the card is that its 3 ocean requirement and the fact that one of your opponent needs to have some heat prot make it impossible to play in the right time frame in many games. But still, I will move both of these cards up 1 tier to D tier. Now let's move on to that D tier, which is home to a staggering 44 cards, plus the 2 I just promoted, but they won't be shown on screen right now. First of all, let's talk about Ants. When I discussed this niche hate card in the second episode, I placed it in D tier, and many people were unhappy with that. There are some great arguments to be made about Ants. It not only is the only half-point microbe in the base game, it also allows you to steal points from your opponents. If you're playing on Hellas, it has considerable extra value due to Eccentric. Still, I think it's a super niche card that is just too situational for a C tier placement for me. Since the base game has so few generically great microbe collecting cards, picking up Ants in the early game is risky, since you never know whether your opponents will actually do you the favor to play a target. And picking it up in the late game will often not be impactful enough to justify its rather steep cost. Besides, a D tier card is still definitely usable in the right situation, and that's what Ants is to me. So it remains just here. A card that I definitely want to move up 1 tier is Archaebacteria. If we compare it to Lichen, which is placed in C tier, it trades late game playability and some combo potential with early game playability and a bit cheaper price. And for a production card, that's actually not too bad. I don't think it deserves to be 1 tier lower than Lichen, and in the same tier as Adapted Lichen, which is a full 3 MC more expensive. So let's move it to C tier. Next up, Aquifer Pumping. Some of you pointed out that this card is definitely not as good of a steal dump as I made it out to be in episode 3, and I couldn't agree more when looking back at it. It's just too expensive. Also, developing tons of steel is an engine play. Placing a lot of oceans is more of a rush play though, so this card contradicts itself by definition. Also, I think I haven't used it a single time since I recorded its episode nearly 2 years back. Down to F tier. Building industries is an interesting one. In episode 6 when I talked about it, I placed it in C tier, but then received a very detailed analysis by Propaganda Panda about it and why it should rather be placed in D tier. I agreed and corrected its placement in episode 13 when I talked about its sister card, Fuel Factory, making Building Industries the only card to be re-ranked during the series runtime. Both it and Fuel Factory happily remain in D tier. Designed Microorganisms is another D tier card that was hotly debated when it got placed in D tier. Many people felt that as the only freely playable 2-plant prot card in the early game, it deserves a C tier placement. I don't really feel that way though. Often enough did I pick it up to only realize that it's just too damn expensive to get down before its max requirement is met. I'm really not a big fan of this card and I think it deserves to stay in D tier. Not flooding though. The placement of this cheap event card was rightly criticized as too low. If you compare it to Subterranean Reservoir, which got placed in C tier, you see that it trades a point for 4 MC, which means increased ease of play, and also a potentially devastating hate effect in the early game. It's just a great rush card to extend your ocean walk in the early game or to end the game quickly. I think it deserves to be bumped up to C tier. When I placed Red Chem Factory in episode 32, people rightfully stated that it's a great steal dump in the late game if you have power left over. For me, there are better late game steal dumps though. Eos Kesma or Open City come to mind, and they either don't need power prot or are just more impactful. Red Chem can stay in D tier in my opinion. And lastly, for the discussion points in D tier, we have Rover Construction. With this card, I really don't know why so many people told me that it deserves a higher placement. Rover Construction to me is just a steel dump for the sake of dumping steel. Its purpose is just to have something to play in the mid-game for Mining Guild, for example. Sure, it's relatively cheap, can help secure builder, and will most of the time pay back if played early. But that's the catch. You need to play it early to increase the chance of it actually paying back, but then have limited control of it actually paying back. But let's move on to C tier, which is actually the most crowded tier with 54 cards originally. The first card I want to talk about is Acquired Company. It was actually the very first card to appear in this series, due to it being the first card in the base game deck when ordered alphabetically. With this card I tried to explain my rating methodology, and I will do it again, because its placement in C tier was somewhat hotly discussed. You know, I have this rating scheme which was down in the description below every video of the series. C tier means that the cards placed in there are strong in some situations, mediocre otherwise, or that you should avoid passing them in the draft in some situations. And I think that perfectly describes Acquired Company. If you get this in your opening 10 or Gen 2 draft, it's a strong development card. If your opponent is Director or Point Luna, you should definitely avoid passing it to them in the early to mid game. But in all other situations, namely in the mid to late game, it's a mediocre or even worthless card. And because rating systems are all about averages, this means Acquired Company is on average a C tier card. But let's move on to a card that I actually did misplace. At least I think I did. Breathing Filters is a pretty unimpactful point card. The science deck can be nice, for example for Scientist, but due to the oxygen requirement, it often arrives too late to be useful for AGT, AI Central or Mass Converter. So Breathing Filters quite regularly is just a mediocre late game point card. And for rush players, it's just useless. I think it should be moved down 1 tier and remain in D tier. A card that was not debated at all in the comments, but I feel that I misplaced, is Heat Trappers. Why do I feel that way? Because I absolutely hate this abomination of a card, and in a good way. Heat Trappers, in my opinion, is the strongest hate card in the base game by far, if played in the early game. Developing Heat Prot is expensive, and losing 2 in an instant is incredibly frustrating, and can absolutely lose your game on the spot. If you've ever been hit by the infamous Heat Trappers and Robotic Workforce combo, just after you've played Mohole, then you have my condolences. It happened to me and I don't want to experience it again. I think Heat Trappers deserves to be moved up one tier, to B tier. Industrial Center, however, is a card that quite a few of you wanted to see moved up to B tier. I don't think that's necessary. Yes, it's almost always useful, either to mess with your opponent's grid, block an Ocean Walk, get access to an Ocean Walk yourself, or collect resources. But often you're at the mercy of your opponents to provide a great spot for it to reach its full potential. It's not a card that's good in a vacuum, and besides, its impact is small enough for me not wanting to put it in B tier. Underrated is also what many of you called pets when I placed it in C tier in episode 29. And looking back at it, I agree. Maybe I had too much of a 2P perspective, but this card not only is one of the easiest animal tags to play, which in and of itself has value, it also can score amazingly in 3P and above. It's not too shabby in 2P either, so I'm inclined to place it in low B tier. And lastly, in the comment section of episode 37, friend of the channel Christo explained to me why he thinks that Symbiotic Fungus is in fact not a C tier card, and I have to agree in retrospect. With its global requirement of minus 14 degrees, it often does not have enough time to have a big enough impact, and besides, its possible targets in the base game are not that great, as we explained earlier when we talked about ants. Moving on to B tier, we start to notice a trend. People had way less problems with the higher ratings in this series. And I think this is partly due to the fact that everybody kinda knows which cards are great and why, and partly due to the fact that I myself often was not able to distinguish between average to bad cards and whether to place them in B, C or D tier. So in B tier we have a respectable 49 cards, but really only 4 stood out to me as potentially being discussable. First of all, and I don't really know why no one had any issues with this, we have Artificial Lake. Now that I think about it, this card is just mediocre and should be moved down to C tier for sure. It can be a nice steal sink in the mid to late game, but it doesn't offer insane value and is really only a true threat on Elysium, where it can be used to swing a state dealer. Next, the placement of Convoy from Europa in episode 8 experienced some pushbacks in the comments, and I see why. On the face of it, it's not cheaper than an SP Ocean, and its niche of being one of the only cards that can be a +2 cards net if you place it on the right spot, is also shared by the SP Ocean. It's just way less impactful than other space events and other cards in the B tier, and probably should not share a tier with Comet. That's why I'll move it down to C tier. It's one of these cards that's regularly okay, but almost never amazing. Next up, let's talk about a card that I possibly misplaced due to favoritism. I love going for high engine science strats, and MATLAB fits right into that. Maybe B tier is a little too high for this card, as if you think about it, it's quite expensive, rarely can be played for great effect in the early game, and is a worse banker swing than cards like Zeppelins, Toll Station or Insulation. But to be sure, it helps with Builder, Contractor and Scientist, and I will leave it in B tier for that. And lastly in this tier, I think we need to talk about Soletta a little more. This is probably the hardest to rate card in the entire deck. It's one of the most game-defining cards that you can play in Gen 1 or 2. If you have Soletta on your starting hand, it's completely viable to just play that and form your game around it. Any later than Gen 3, however, it often is just completely and utterly useless. So how to rank a card that has such reliability? I decided to place it in B tier, and I stand by that. It's an amazing card in the right circumstance, but yeah, it's not great otherwise. When looking at A tier with its 29 cards, I don't really see any card that could have been placed in a different tier. And most of you agreed. No card really sparked any huge debate. Let's still talk about a few. Anti-gravity technology, of course, is the one with the highest potential. Similar to Soletta, it's game-defining if you can play it early. And it will magically force you to keep it in a draft and pivot to science. But often it can be bait, and of course, it's utterly useless in a rush. One of the only cards I was really on the fence about whether to place it in A tier was Water Import from Europa. In my mind, it's the worst of the Jovian multipliers, but that's the thing. Jovian multipliers by definition are a threat in the draft, because no matter how expensive they are and how useless their secondary ability is, they can score incredibly well and win games. Therefore, A tier it is. One more discussion point could be mass converter. If you think about it, it grants insane value for its price, and while the 5 science tech requirement is steep, it's often a lot easier to reach in comparison to HT7. You could definitely make an argument to move it to S tier, and I think a lot of people have it up there in their own lists, but I'll keep it in A tier for now. And lastly, let's move on to S tier itself. Once again, I don't think I want to move any cards here. AI Central, Demos Down, Earth Catapult, Ecozone, GIA, Insects, Kelp, Large Convoy, Mars U, NRA, Research Outpost, Restricted Area, TG, and Viral are the 14 undisputed kings of the base game for me. The only card that sparked a little debate in the comments was Ecozone. But honestly, this is one of the central pieces of the green combo, and it can be insane in the right circumstances. It is a threat in the draft at almost all stages of the game, and therefore should never be underestimated. I will leave S tier as is. So that's it, my final revisions to the base game project cards tier list. Once again, you can find the original ranking and the updated one as a Google Doc in the description of this video. Go check them out if you want to use them for future reference. But what will happen next? Well, I will of course move on to the expansions, and Prelude will be the first one to discuss. It actually only comes with 7 project cards, so it will only take one episode to go through that stack. If you want a tier list for the actual Preludes, I have one linked in the description below. After that, I will move on to Venus Next, which has 49 project cards to go over, and we will definitely have to wait and see what I'll do afterwards. But now let me thank you for watching until the end of this final video of my rating base game cards series. If you enjoyed the video and the series, please leave a like, subscribe, and please check me out on Twitch, where I livestream my Terraforming Mars gameplay. Thank you all for your support in the past few months and years, and I hope I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one, guys, and goodbye.